that I'll stay within the time limit. Okay. As Denny mentioned, we're a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization. We've been around since 2001. Our mission, in a sentence, is to increase government effectiveness through the use of rigorous evidence about what works, particularly in social spending. We've worked closely with both the Bush administration and the Obama administration and Congress to advance evidence-based reforms. A number of the concepts and reforms that we've advocated have been enacted into law. For example, there are 7 evidence-based, what are called tiered evidence programs, including the HHS evidence-based home visitation program that we help conceptualize and to advance. So I have been asked to talk about the process of how does science, how does evidence influence the policy process? So I'll talk about that from the perspective of our experience. The biggest challenge we found in advancing evidence-based policy is to find individual policymakers who are in a senior position, influential position, and who prioritize evidence and evidence-based reform as part of their work. When we find people like that, whether they are members of Congress or congressional staff or people in the executive branch, our joke around the office, but it's not really a joke, is that we drop everything and support them, help them, do whatever we can. Because of the initiatives that I described, the 7 that have been enacted into law, there are probably 6 or 7 people in the executive branch and Congress, etc., who have been the main movers behind that. So the champions, where you can find them, have been the key to advancing all of these reforms. So I'm going to talk briefly about 7, make that 8, ingredients that we found to be key factors in engaging policymakers in evidence-based reform. The first piece is that we make clear in all of our work that we have no financial interest in any of the ideas that we are advocating. We're not affiliated with any programs or program models. We don't receive funding for research or evaluation from any federal programs. Our work is funded entirely by private philanthropic foundations. That's number one. Related to that, we don't spin the evidence. There are very strong incentives within the field for the reporting of positive findings from evaluations, and when they are reported, to portray them in the most favorable possible light. From the standpoint of an academic researcher, it's much more likely for them to get their research published if they have a positive finding. It's very hard to get a finding of no effect published. From the standpoint of a program provider, positive evaluation findings are often the key to future funding. In most cases, there is no incentive and often a strong disincentive to report negative or null or adverse impact findings, because that can jeopardize your research funding, it can jeopardize your program. So there are a number of studies that found there is a very strong positive spin, an upward bias, a distortion in the way that research findings are reported. One of our main goals is to be a neutral reporter of the evidence, to serve in a way as a counterweight to many of the exaggerated claims of positive impact findings. And finally, so I guess the central theme between the no financial interest and reporting things straight is we try to build a sense of trust with policy officials and others that we're just straight shooters on all of this. We've no spin, no axe to grind. We also explain research findings. We're not, Moses coming down from the mountain saying, here are the findings on rigorous evidence, trust us. We try to explain why findings are credible, not credible, exaggerated, or presented in a straightforward way. So that's number one. We try to serve as a neutral party. In our number two, and this is the one I'm going to spend the most time on, but I will not spend that much time on. The biggest obstacle in our experience to the advancement of evidence-based reforms is inertia, meaning that most policy officials they're being asked to do 500 things. And the unstated question in any meeting is, why this? Why should I prioritize what you're talking about, evidence-based policy, as opposed to the 499 other things that I'm being asked to do? They may agree, but why should they really go out of their way to move this along? So if I want to leave you with one thought on this whole process, one takeaway, it's that you have to make before you get into the details of what you're suggesting and so on, in our experience, the most important thing is to make a persuasive case, a compelling case for evidence-based reform, why it really makes a difference. So I'm going to give you a very short sense of that, of the case that we make at least. Others may make it differently, to give you a sense of how that works. The point we try to make is that evidence-based reform is not just a desirable policy change, that it may be essential if our country is going to make progress against educational failure, poverty, and other social problems. Here's why. If the history of rigorous evaluations has taught us anything, it's that many widely held beliefs about what works in medicine, social spendings, and other fields is not accurate. In business, Jim Manzi has published a new book recently reporting that Google and Microsoft have conducted in the last few years 13,000 randomized controlled trials, which are considered the strongest evaluation method. Randomized trials of different business strategies, 80 to 90% of which were found to have no significant effect. In his words, innovative ideas rarely work. In medicine, reviews have found that between 50 and 80% of positive findings in initial clinical studies, which are small randomized trials or matched comparison group studies, the majority of the initial positive findings are overturned when a more definitive randomized trial is done in phase 3, which is required by the FDA for marketing of a new drug or pharmaceutical device. So this is a case, even where you have really promising evidence initially, the majority of that is again found not to work when definitively evaluated. Finally, in social spending, just to give you one example, but the pattern holds out, across the board. In education, the Institute of Education Sciences, which is the research arm of the Department of Education, has conducted 90 large field experiments since 2002, randomized controlled trials of different educational strategies, everything from school choice programs to teacher training programs, curricula, and so on. Close to 90% of those evaluations have found that the intervention, the educational intervention, produced weak or no positive effects compared to what schools were doing anyway. And that was true even for a number of practices that everybody had thought of as evidence-based, based on initial evidence. In short, an absolutely clear lesson from past rigorous evaluations is the need for humility in our beliefs about what works and the fundamental importance of rigorous testing if our efforts in medicine, social spending, and other fields are going to improve the human condition. Now, in medicine, we've seen amazing progress over the last 50 years. Even though, as I just mentioned, the large majority of medical interventions when rigorously tested are found not to work. How did that happen? I suggest the answer is that in medicine, the system is set up to reward rigorous evidence of effectiveness. Since 1962, the Food and Drug Administration has required 2 well-conducted randomized controlled trials showing clinically meaningful effects before it will allow a new drug or medical device onto the market. That creates an enormous incentive for the development of rigorous, strong experimental evidence, and also the mechanism, when you have strong replicated evidence, to put it into widespread use. Findings from those trials and others sponsored by NIH and others have profoundly improved life in America. Just to give you one example, they have, but there are many examples, those trials have definitively established the effectiveness of treatments for hypertension and high cholesterol, which have cut the incidence of coronary heart disease and stroke in this country, our nation's first and third leading killers, by more than half since the 1960s. Now, social spending is similar to medicine in that While most rigorous evaluations produce disappointing results, there are some clear examples of demonstrated effectiveness. New York City Small Schools of Choice, for example, is a recent example. This was a case where a large, convincing, randomized controlled trial, 20,000 low-income students randomly assigned in New York to small schools versus traditional large public high schools. At the 6-year follow-up, the study found that small schools of choice increased high school graduation and college enrollment the next year by 15 to 20% compared to the control students. And the small schools cost less than traditional large public high schools per student. So that's an example of a very strong positive impact finding. Now, in contrast to medicine, such rare and important evidence in social spending generally is not rewarded in the current system. Most large federal social programs like Head Start, Title I funding at the Department of Education, the Workforce Investment Act, are set up as large faucets where Congress has directed the federal agencies to allocate large streams of funding to state and local organizations, sometimes through a formula funding, sometimes through competition, but where evidence about what's effective and what isn't effective plays very little role in what gets funded. So activities or interventions like small schools of choice are not prioritized for greater funding under these federal faucet funding, and may never expand. And in fact, in New York, under a new mayor, the opposite is happening. The small schools approach is not being continued with federal or with other funds. And so it goes across social spending. Interventions come and go. There's no systematic mechanism in place to identify what worked and put it into widespread use. Little progress is made. So the two evidence-based reforms that we have sought to advance and which have been incorporated in some of the enacted legislation, the two central concepts are, one, an allocation of funds, like in the Second Chance Act you were referring to, an allocation of funds for rigorous, preferably randomized evaluations in order to grow the number of the subset of proven effective approaches, identify what does work. And second, when you have those unusual instances of demonstrated effectiveness, to prioritize those for funding and large-scale dissemination with close adherence to the program model. And we believe if those two concepts were incorporated into large social spending programs, not just these 7 initiatives I mentioned, but into billion-dollar programs, it would fundamentally shift the social spending landscape and greatly improve the effectiveness of government in improving people's lives. So that is the core case that we make. I'm going to go through very quickly the other items, the ingredients to affecting policy. When we meet with policy officials, we know, we've done our homework beforehand, we know the specific reforms, we know their policy area, we know the specific reforms we're requesting, or we have a set of options that they might consider. Number 4, we offer, wherever they would like us to do the detailed work for them to help drafting legislative provisions or grant solicitations, in developing evidence standards, and so on. Number 5, we try to start at the top. If we can meet with a member of Congress first, then with the staff, that's usually better. We had a board member, Jerry Lee, who knew Senator Arlen Specter very well, and we met with him twice. Each meeting was about 5 minutes. He said, "Jerry, of course we're going to do this. This sounds like a great idea." I think he wanted to please his constituent. After that, we worked with his staffer on the Appropriations Committee, who became one of these people who helped move a number of these ideas forward. The idea in that sort of situation, if the member has signed off, the staffer has the authorization to work, has the mandate to